Hello again everyone, and welcome back to the channel. In today's video we are taking another look at the Red Wing Lockheed L1049 Super-Constellation. Some of you may remember that we actually took a look at the Connie a fair old while ago when the product first released. The L1049 released in early access, I would say in a pretty rough and ready state initially, and we discussed that in the previous review. Quite a lot has been done to the product since then though. I gather as well it's just released on the in-sim marketplace. And the Super-Constellation, without a doubt, is the product I get the most number of requests for to take a repeat look. So we are going to be taking the aircraft on another outing, carrying out a full review of the product. A little bit of a theme for you here as well today. You can see we are currently on the ground at Longreach Airport, which I believe was the first operational base of QANTAS. It's also home to the QANTAS Founders Outback Museum. You can see just behind us we have both a 747 and a 707. The museum does actually also host a Lockheed L1049, but that's parked a little bit further around the back. Today though we're going to get the Super Connie up in the skies once again, cruising over northeastern Australia with a flight from Longreach up to Cairns. One of the most significant upgrades to the Red Wing Constellation, we now have both an automated co-pilot and flight engineer. Previously we flew the Connie all by ourselves, a single pilot operation. I thought today's video would be a nice opportunity to demonstrate the automatic crew functionality to you. So we're still going to be operating as pilot in command from the left seat, but we'll have both the automated flight engineer and the co-pilot here helping us out along for the ride. I do hope that you enjoy another outing in the Super-Constellation. If you do, please consider giving the video a like and subscribing to the channel. We can get the review underway by first taking a look at the improved external modelling and texturing of the aircraft. So Red Wing have certainly made significant improvements to the aircraft visually, both internally and externally, since we last took a look at the product. If I recall correctly from my last review, the aircraft did look pretty decent from a distance, but certainly when you got up close and looked at some of the finer details, they were quite rough and ready. A lot of that detailing has been polished up, and it looks to me as well as though new materials have been modelled in terms of PBR texturing. Certainly the Constellation looks a lot more photorealistic now, particularly in the external model. Bear in mind that we are looking at a third-party repaint here as well. The aircraft actually only comes with 3 repaints. They're all broadly done to the same standard, I would say. I thought it would be worth taking another look at the engines, as those are an area that I recall looking particularly rough around the edges in terms of the modelling last time. I seem to recall that there was some clipping between the engine exhausts and the cowl flaps. That seems to have all been neatened up now, which is great. The aircraft is certainly looking a whole lot better externally, as I say, although there are still some rougher areas on the model. For example, you can see where the engines there join onto the wing root, and indeed where the wing itself joins onto the body. Not the nicest modelling I've seen, and the same goes there with the texturing on the riveting. Similarly, there are still parts of the aircraft where if you get a little bit closer in, the modelling is pretty basic, same goes for the texturing. So all in all, I would say in its current state, the Red Wing L1049 isn't going to be in the running for the most beautiful aircraft in the sim, but nevertheless the visual improvements to the product are very noticeable, and I think now that the Constellation holds up quite nicely as a Microsoft Flight Simulator product. The internals of the aircraft have also had a pretty drastic overhaul, not only in terms of modelling and texturing, but also in terms of systems and functionality. So we'll head for the flight deck now and we'll go and take a look at those. So coming onto the flight deck then of the Super Connie, and again for those of you who recall our previous review, there has been some significant improvements in terms of both visual modelling and texturing. The vast majority of the cockpit is modelled in terms of controls, indications and systems. Really the only station that seems to be inoperable is the radio navigation station just down on our left behind us. Texturing is much improved. The aircraft certainly looks more lifelike now with more appropriate colouring and weathering. Again, I would say that the cockpit is now up to an acceptable level. Some parts look better than others, but again, it isn't going to be rivaling some of the very best developers in the sim in terms of visual fidelity. One gripe that I do have in the cockpit is the overall level of precision that's been given to some of the instruments and controls. Some of the proportions in the cockpit, to me at least, look to be a little bit off, and the instruments as well aren't the best. They're quite hard to read in some circumstances. The fonts aren't all that clear, the operation isn't necessarily all that smooth. And some of the instruments as well are a little bit offset from centre. You'll notice later on during our flight that the attitude indicator isn't perfectly aligned. The same goes with some of the switches, they aren't necessarily always aligned perfectly with the centre of their movement. It may perhaps be that Red Wing is trying to model older equipment with lower manufacturing tolerances, but I suspect not. You'll notice as well later on when we make use of the automated crew that some of the callouts don't necessarily match up with the switching position at the time. So again, I do want to stress that the product has come along in absolute leaps and bounds, but there is still work that could be done in just polishing up some of the finer details. As I say though, almost the entirety of the flight deck and its systems are modelled. We have the flight engineer station as well. You can either operate from the flight engineer station yourself, as I demonstrated in my previous review, or as we've already discussed, there is also now an automated flight engineer to help you with your task. A lot more functionality on the product than when we previously looked at it, a lot of nice touches around the cockpit as well. For example, here we have a nice little flight engineer's handbook which you can flip out and open up. That gives us a couple of options that we can select on and off, as well as a readout of all of the various consumables on board the aircraft, so fuel and oil for example. And after that we have rather a nice schematic of the fuel system to help guide you through management and configuration of the aircraft's fuel system. Looking towards the rear of the flight deck, again you can see the navigator's position there on the right. As I say, nothing seems to be operable in that particular station. The cockpit door is also operable, and just behind we have a member of the cabin crew, dependent on the phase of flight. Again, the modelling isn't the best I've seen, but nevertheless it's a really nice detail. It's not something I've seen from many other developers. Lastly, we'll take a look at the onboard clipboard, which is essentially the same as the onboard tablet we see in most add-ons these days. I have to say, really nice functionality here, and I like as well that it's been made aesthetically sensitive to the aircraft. From the clipboard we can control a whole host of options with regards to the L1049, and it's the functionality that you'll see in just a second's time that arguably sets the aircraft apart from much of the competition. We'll talk more about pricing and value for money towards the end of the video, but certainly there are some options here in the clipboard that I haven't seen with other products. Starting then with the main menu, we can first choose between an easy, normal and realistic flight model. In terms of the human assistance options, which again is something we're going to be touching on quite a bit here today, you can actually have not only an AI co-pilot and flight engineer, but also an AI pilot as well. Lastly, we also have some GPS options. You can fit either the Garmin GTN 750 or 650, or both units together should you so wish. The clipboard also has a checklist tab with comprehensive checklists detailing each phase of flight. Certainly a very convenient, nice functionality to have, but as I say, we're going to be making use of both our automated flight engineer and co-pilot to run the checklist today. The ground and fuel page, much as you would expect, here we can load up both the fuel quantity. We can also replenish various fluids on board the aircraft, so for example hydraulic, alcohol and oil quantities. By this page we can also repair the aircraft if we suffer any damage. We'll talk more about that in just a moment's time. You can also fit or remove the wingtip tanks, and finally as well you can adjust the trim sensitivity. The CG and load page, again fairly straightforward here. We can load up the aircraft based on various configurations. We're going to be using the national configuration for our flight today. The same goes with the fuel loading. All up, that's giving us a takeoff weight of around 101,650 pounds. You'll notice on the clipboard there are still some options currently unavailable. So for example, we can choose to load up the aircraft with passengers. Currently, it seems as though cargo and interestingly litter as well are not selectable options. I presume they'll be modelled at a later date. From here we can also add or remove the external ground equipment, which we saw from the external shots just a moment ago. A little bit strange perhaps that the external ground equipment is selected via the CG and load page as opposed to the ground and fuel page. Status, as the name would suggest, details the status of your aircraft. Failure modelling and damage modelling on the Connie is actually pretty good. We'll be taking more of a look at that later on. But here, for example, you can see the state of the flight controls, the state of the engines, the state of various systems. The orders page we are certainly going to be getting a good look at throughout our flight. From this page we can give both our automated co-pilot and flight engineer instructions. So we can have our crew run through checklists and configure the aircraft accordingly. We can also have the engines set for various phases of flight, which is a more realistic option overall. As mentioned, from what I can see here as well, the AI co-pilot can also manage a heading, a speed and an altitude, as well as both the takeoff and landing phase of flight, but again I haven't tried that myself. As I say, we'll get plenty of opportunity to look at this page again throughout our flight. And finally, coming on to the failure and emergency page, which again wasn't currently available I think when we previously took a look at the product. Here you can see there is a fairly comprehensive list of selectable failures. We're not going to be running one for our flight today, but we'll take a look towards the end of the video nevertheless. From the couple of failure scenarios that I have tried, the system seems to work pretty well overall. And I have to say it's really great as well to see more and more add-ons coming into the sim that do offer this sort of functionality. Anyway, that just about wraps up our look at the clipboard. As I say, a pretty comprehensive feature of the aircraft overall. Certainly some pretty nice functionality there, although again there do seem to be just one or two options that are currently inoperative. As I've already mentioned, we'll take a look at a couple more things towards the end of the video, but for now we are ready for our flight. We'll have both the AI flight engineer and co-pilot join us here on the flight deck, and we'll get the L1049 ready to go. Right, so we now have ourselves comfortably planted here in the left-hand seat of the L1049. As we discussed just a moment ago, we do have a crew on board the aircraft today, not just visually, but they're also going to be helping us in our endeavours. We are more or less ready for boarding at this point, so we'll just have both the co-pilot and the flight engineer carry out the before start checklist. And I'm going to keep pretty quiet throughout as they set up the aircraft so that you can hear them carrying out their tasks.
Checklist before starting engines. Remove before flight.
Checked.
Battery.
On.
Dome light.
On and white.
Nav lights.
On.
Radio and instrument switches.
On.
COM1 and COM2 panels.
On. And OK.
Ground power.
Connected.
All services.
Checked. Removed.
Ground power.
On.
Parking brake. Check and set. Aileron and rudder boosters. On. Elevator booster. On. Ordnance lights. On. Cabin lights. On. Stairs. On. Main door.
Open.
Dump valves. Checked. Emergency cut-off levers. On. Fuel tank selectors.
1, 2, 3, 4. On.
Coal flaps.
1, 2, 3, 4. Open.
Carburetor air.
1, 2, 3, 4. Set to cold.
Oil cooler flaps.
1, 2, 3, 4. Open.
Cross weight and center of gravity.
Weights and balances checked and confirmed.
Prepare for boarding.
Okay, so the aircraft is now ready for boarding. The cabin's also had quite a rework on the Red Wing L1049, so we'll go down the back there, we'll take a quick look as the passengers board, and we'll come back to the flight deck once we're ready for the engine start. So once again, it is nice to see that Red Wing have done a significant amount of work down the back as well. The cabin is certainly vastly improved since we last took a look at the aircraft. Anyway, everyone is now on board, so we'll have the crew run through the end of boarding checklist.
End of boarding. Resume before startup checklist.
Fire warning system. 1. 2. 3. 4. 5. Close all doors.
Checked.
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 Stairs.
Checked. Removed.
Chokes. Check. Checklist before starting engines complete.
You can hear then just a couple of the pronunciations are a little bit iffy, but nevertheless the checklist is now complete. We are ready for the start. We'll try and catch at least one of the engine starts visually, since the smoke effects on the aircraft are rather nice. And again, the startup sequence is much improved over the previous version of the aircraft that we looked at. So again, we'll have the crew now run through the start checks, and I'll keep pretty quiet as we do that.
Checklist starting engines. Position lights.
On.
Starter engine 3. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ignition engine 3. Hydraulic 2 to hydraulic 1 crossfit.
Checked and OK.
Generator 3.
On.
Starter engine 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Ignition engine 4. Generator 4.
On.
Starter engine 2.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Ignition engine 2. Generator 2.
On.
Starter engine 1.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.
Ignition engine 1. Generator 1.
On.
Checklist starting engines completed.
So we do have 4 good starts. Again, really nice smoke effects there, some of the best that I've seen in the sim. The smoke does rather tend to be carried by the wind as opposed to pushed back by the thruster on the prop, but nevertheless very nice to see. The radial engines also do start rather readily, which seems a little bit unlikely, but I suppose that's as a function of using the artificial flight engineer. Anyway, we'll sit here on the ramp, we'll let everything warm up. In the meantime, we'll have the crew run through the warm-up checks.
Checklist during warm-up. Height dot covers and gear pins.
All on board.
Ground power.
Off.
Battery and generators.
Checked.
Engine instruments.
Checked.
Autopilot gyro.
Caged and released.
Radios. Set. Checklist warm-up completed.
So we'll sit here just a little bit longer, letting everything warm up. Ordinarily at this point that would be a really nice time to start setting the aircraft up for the departure and the flight. Unfortunately though, we planned most of our flight today using NDBs en route, and it seems to me that the ADF radio is currently inoperative. That has been a bug on the aircraft for quite some time now, and having looked at the changelog, it does seem as though Red Wing would suggest they fixed it up, but it doesn't seem to be the case here. For example, later on we're going to need the Cairns VOR, which is on a frequency of 113.0, and we can tune that up very readily. As you can see, we have 1130. We'll just get the transponder on there as well whilst we're down here. Unfortunately though, as I say, it looks like the ADF radio doesn't actually work, so we're going to have to go pretty old school here. We'll have to dead reckon our way out through most of the route until we pick up the Cairns VOR. The flight plan had us departing out of Longreach off the Longreach NDB. We're then going to pick up the Hyundai NDB and take that out towards Cairns. But as I say, once we pick up the VOR we should be okay. We can follow that in towards destination. So with that being said, there's not a whole lot of preparation for us to do here in terms of setting the aircraft up for the departure. We are now ready for the taxi then, so we'll have the crew run through the taxi checks.
Checklist taxiing. Taxi lights.
On and extended.
Clock and altimeters. Set.
And set.
Brake selector lever.
Set.
All turn indicators.
Checked.
Checked. Proper reversing. The gyro is caged.
So someone getting a little bit excited there about the gyro. Not really an issue at this moment in time. Really nice reverse prop sounds there though.
Checklist taxiing complete.
So the taxi checklist is now complete and we can make our way out towards the runway. Right, so we are now down at the holding point for runway 04. Rather bizarrely, I'm pretty positive there was a windsock earlier down at the threshold. That seems to have disappeared. I don't know whether or not that's a little bug that's crept in with Sim Update 10. Nevertheless, the wind was slightly favouring 04. It's a nice short taxi for us as well. We'll have the crew run through the before takeoff checks.
Checklist takeoff. Rudder ignition.
1 completed. 2 completed. 3 completed. 4 completed.
Run-up phasering.
1 completed. 2 completed. 3 completed. 4 completed.
Door and windows.
Closed.
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 Trim tabs.
Checked.
Wing flaps test. Checked. Auxiliary control boosters. On. Auto feather.
Armed for takeoff.
Landing lights.
On.
Mixtures.
Auto bridge.
Carburetor air.
Cold.
Air conditioning.
Panel set.
Fuel pumps.
1, 2, 3, 4, high.
Oil cooler flaps.
Set.
Checklist before takeoff completed.
Okay, the before takeoff checklist is complete. We are cleared for the takeoff. And all clear on final. We'll have the takeoff clearance checklist run.
Checklist takeoff clearance.
And part brake off.
Flaps.
Set to 30%.
Controls.
3. No-go speed is 103 knots. Runway is dry.
Checklist takeoff completed.
Okay, so V1103. Just hold the aircraft on the brakes momentarily. So we'll come up to 44 inches on the manifold pressure. And then we'll have our co-pilot set max power.
Max power.
Roger.
And off the
Max
brakes.
power.
So power is set. There's 60 knots.
Power set.
No-go speed.
And V1.
Rotation.
Coming back on the yoke. And we do have positive climb. The gear can come up. So we'll pitch initially for a climb of 160 knots. And we'll get the co-pilot now to bring the throttles back towards METO power.
Power.
Roger, METO power.
And we'll accelerate slowly now up to 180 knots. Then we contract the flaps. And for our heading out towards Hughenden, we're looking for 351. So we'll start a left turn here, just a nice shallow left bank. Good now on the speed. So we'll get the flaps up.
Roger, flaps up.
Obviously losing some lift there, but losing some drag as well. So the speed just coming up, we'll pitch up to maintain 180.
Flaps up.
You can see that speed really coming up now. We've got the flaps in, so we'll come back to climb power.
Climb power.
Roger.
And we're doing about 200 knots now. Pretty good on the speed, so we'll just maintain current speed, pitching the aircraft accordingly. Just come on to a heading with 360. Looks like we're going to be coming through the cloud layer fairly shortly. OT is still good in terms of any icing. There's 351 on the heading. So now just trimming the aircraft to maintain the speed, and then we'll get the autopilot in. The L1049 certainly very heavy and trim, needing a lot of trim here. That is an option we can adjust via the clipboard, as we saw earlier on. Pretty comfortable now though, we're doing about 1,000 feet per minute rate of climb. So we'll get the autopilot master on. Just come back slightly here on the pitch wheel in anticipation of the climb. And we'll engage the autopilot.
He's engaged.
Out control going on as well. A little bit fiddly there on the click spots. And again, just pitching for around 1,000 feet per minute. The granularity there on the autopilot selection is pretty limited, and as you saw there, quite abrupt engagement there as well. But anyway, looking good on the speed. Climb power is set, flaps are up, gear is up. And we can have the crew run through the after takeoff checks.
Climb checklist. Landing gear lever. Up and up. Wing flaps. Up. Steering control boosters. Off. Nose light. Off. Taxi light.
Retracted and off.
Fuel pumps.
1, 2, 3, 4. Low.
Oil cooler flaps.
Set.
Auto freezing.
Off.
Cold flaps.
Set.
Ordnance lights.
Off.
Climb checklist completed.
So climb checklist is complete. We're just going to get the seatbelt signs back on for now. Still fairly low altitude here and coming up through the weather. Not that it's particularly significant, but nevertheless, just to save them getting bumped around. Just easing off there on the climb as well, doing about 750 feet per minute now. That's maintaining around 200 knots here. Slightly off on the heading, so we'll just come out to the right. And again, in terms of temperature, still 20 degrees OAT, so we're good in terms of any icing. Looks like we're almost clear of the cloud layer now anyway. There's our heading, so we'll go wings level once again. And coming up now through 6,000 feet, cruising to stay at flight level 200 initially. We'll climb again up to flight level 210 as we come overhead the Hughenden NDB. As discussed, the plan here was to track outbound on the Longreach NDB inbound towards Hughenden. We'll pick up Hughenden and then turn out towards the northeast, tracking off Hughenden and then hopefully picking up the Cairns VOR to track inbound towards destination. Again, unfortunately, no operative ADF radio on the aircraft, so we'll just have to dead reckon our way over towards Hughenden. We can then turn on our heading up towards Cairns, and we should pick up the Cairns VOR at least 100 miles or so out, so we can pick up the DME there, use that to refine our descent and our arrival in towards destination. So, welcome back to the flight deck. I do hope you enjoyed the rather beautiful scenery there as we made our way through northeastern Australia. Really rather impressive how well dead reckoning always works, even in an aircraft of this type. We only ended up a couple of miles out to the east of Hughenden, and we're now tracking quite nicely inbound towards Cairns. You can see we are now picking up the Cairns DME, about 90 miles to run, tracking inbound on the 013 radial. According to our flight plan, top descent is at 90 miles, so we'll descend the aircraft very shortly. Just before we do that though, we're going to come slightly out to the right on the heading. That's to set ourselves up for the arrival. We'll discuss more about that in just a moment's time. We'll come on to heading of around 030 for the time being. So just coming on to 030. And we can level the wings once again. Before we commence the descent, we'll have the co-pilot and the flight engineer run the before descent checklist.
Before descent checklist. Autopilot servo disconnected levers. Boarding slides.
Set.
Altimeter set.
Set.
Engine superchargers. Low. Fuel pumps.
1, 2, 3, 4, high.
Fuel tank selector.
1, 2 alpha, 3 alpha, 4, on and confirmed.
Tank 5 and fuel crossfeed levers.
Closed.
Cabin pressure.
Cabin pressure confirmed for landing.
Landing weight.
Landing weight checked.
Before descent checklist completed.
Okay, so the checklist is complete. We'll have the first officer bring our power back to our descent setting.
Power, please.
Roger.
So slowly bringing the throttles back, power rolling off. Speed should start reducing momentarily. We're going to put the aircraft into a descent though. And we're going to be aiming for around 1,000 feet per minute rate of descent. We'll manage that accordingly based on our indicated airspeed. And there's our 1,000 feet per minute, just coming through flight level 210. That means we need about 84 miles to run, currently showing around 80. However, that's a direct distance and we're actually going to be flying a little bit of dogleg here, so pretty nice here in terms of our top of descent. Anyway, as we get the aircraft coming down, we'll start briefing up for the arrival. We're planning on flying the Innisfail DME or GNSS arrival into Cairns. Obviously we're going to be flying the DME arrival. We are going to have to fudge it a little bit though. Unfortunately, again, we're not going to be able to tune up the Innisfail NDB. So instead we're just going to come inbound on the radial. We'll talk more about that in just a moment's time. For the arrival then, it's plate 10-2. The Cairns VOR on a frequency of 113.0. We've already got that tuned up. NDB on a frequency of 364, but again, not relevant to us today. Final approach course is 333, so we can set that now. And we have 333 set on the OBS. There's an altitude check at the final approach fix of 3,000 feet. We're heading down to an MDA of 1720, 1710 on the rad out, so we can set that. And there's 1710. For the missed approach, it's a right turn to intercept the 040 radial outbound from the Cairns VOR, climbing up to an altitude of 5,000 feet. And tracking outbound towards 15 miles from Cairns, or as directed by air traffic. Transition level is flight level 110. In terms of the terrain, there is significant terrain coming in towards Cairns. The MSA for the arrival, 6,500. We're going to descend initially down to 7,000 feet here until we come over the initial approach fix, and then we'll step our way down. It's a 3-degree slope on the arrival towards the MDA. Otherwise, much the same as we saw out of Longreach. Really nice afternoon here. Obviously a bit of cloud coverage around, but otherwise very pleasant conditions. Temperature on the ground is around 35 degrees. QNH is 1016. Wind-wise, not much wind to speak of, so we'll be fine on runway 33. It does mention on the chart, no straight approach onto runway 33 unless we're visual by 10 miles from Cairns. No issues I'm anticipating there today in terms of being visual. We should be visual very early. If we are, we'll probably take the autopilot out here and fly a bit of a visual approach onto runway 33. If we need it, we do also have the localizer approach onto the runway, so that's on a frequency of 109.5. We can tune that up on nav 2. Still no sounds associated yet with operating the radios, which is a bit of a shame, but we have 109.5. And obviously we're not picking up the DME yet there from the loc. We're not going to bother briefing up the approach there for the localizer, since again I highly suspect we won't need it. Anyway, as discussed, landing on runway 33. It's going to be manual braking. We'll use full reverse there on the props to try and avoid cooking the brakes. No spoilers, of course. Planning to vacate off to the right, probably at Bravo 3. And then we can just take the main taxiway there straight in towards the domestic terminal. As far as alternates go, we're not actually holding an alternate today. Instead, we've got island reserve fuel, so about an extra 2 hours of fuel up our sleeves upon arrival. Obviously, the weather's absolutely fine. So everything looking pretty good here for the time being. The briefing is complete. We'll just continue our way down, and I'll come back to you again once we're a little bit closer in towards Cairns and ready to fly the approach itself. Okay, so we're just coming up through 20 DME, which we said was the initial approach fix. We'll be starting our descent at 18.8 miles. Doing about 180 knots here over the ground, so we'll need a descent rate of around 900 feet per minute. And just closing up the throttles momentarily, just to let that speed come back. Flap limit speed for 60% flaps is 190 knots. For 80 miles we want to be at 6,540. So looking good on profile here at the moment. Pretty nicely established here on the radial. If anything, we're just slightly out to the left, so we'll just adjust our heading. And already visual with the city, pretty much visual here as well with the runway, but we'll just leave the autopilot in a little bit longer. Through 60 miles, we're looking for 5,900 feet. And there's 16 DME, 5,900, so again, good on profile. As we discussed during the briefing, plenty of high terrain there out towards the west. And we're pretty much following that in all the way towards the airport. Anyway, we are below 190 knots now, so we'll take flap 60. That should help start to reduce the speed. 40 miles, we're looking for 5,270.
Flaps 60% set.
And flap 60 checked. Just coming up on 14 DME. And just about 50 feet high currently, but we'll leave the vertical speed where it is for now. Doing 1,000 feet per minute here in the descent, coming back through 170 knots, so we should be slowly trending back towards our 3-degree profile. So as you can see, we'll be coming over Cairns itself, the city centre that is, and then inbound towards the airfield. If we need to make a missed approach, as discussed, we'll be heading out towards the water. For the gear extension, speed limit there is 165 knots. Just coming up on 160 knots now. As we are nicely visual here, we'll take out the autopilot.
The pilot is disengaged.
The aircraft feeling very left-wing heavy. We'll just put in a little bit of rudder trim here to counteract that. The ball is slightly out to the left currently. We'll take the gear down. And it looks as though we're slightly high here on profile at the moment, so we'll keep the power back for the time being. You can see there, even with a ton of rudder trim in, the ball's still out to the left. Nevertheless, the aircraft is feeling a little bit better now in terms of its handling. Again, we are quite high, so we'll take flaps 80.
Flaps 80% set.
Not sure why we need quite so much rudder trim there. The aircraft felt pretty good during the departure. We've got even power settings there across all 4 engines. So that's a little bit strange. Anyway, we'll have the chaps run through the before landing checks.
Flaps 80% landing checklist. De-icer boost off. Mixtures.
Auto bridge.
Fuel pumps.
1, 2, 3, 4, high.
Carburetor air.
Cold.
Steering control boosters. On. Manifold.
Set.
RPM.
Set. Roger. Power
Raise.
set. Set.
Landing checklist completed.
Prepare for landing.
Flaps 80% set.
So the landing checks are complete, still a little bit high. We'll go to landing flap. That should help get the speed back, get us back on profile. Just coming up on 140 knots. And again, we've still got a ton of rudder trim in here, but nevertheless the ball is now centered up. So the aircraft hand flying rather more nicely. Again though, I'm not sure where that imbalance is coming from with the engines all set. Same power setting here. Seems a little bit odd. Anyway, 1 red, 3 whites there on the PAPI, so coming back onto our 3-degree slope. And speed 140 knots now. We'll just let that slowly bleed off here as we come down final approach. There's 2 reds, 2 whites. As discussed, we're going to be touching down runway 33. We'll vacate off at Bravo 3, which is the 3rd exit on the right. Initially just using reverse on the props to get the aircraft slowed down, and we'll come onto the brakes as we approach the exit.
500 feet.
Yeah, it's checked 500. Just trending a touch low, correcting for that. Yeah, the Connie feels way more of a handful than it did when I previously flew the aircraft. Previously I seem to recall it flying quite nicely. And as I said, it did fly quite nicely on the departure out of Longreach, so I'm not really sure why it feels quite so peculiar here. Almost feel like I'm a little bit of a passenger really, it doesn't feel quite right on the controls.
50, 30,
So back on the power levers.
20.
There's touchdown. We'll come up on the reversers. Reversers there wanting to kick the aircraft out to the left. Having to use quite a lot of rudder there and brake as well just to keep the aircraft on the centre line.
Speed down.
Certainly not the prettiest landing I've done, but as I say, the aircraft does feel very strange there in terms of its handling characteristics on the approach and indeed during the landing. Anyway, onto the brakes, we'll get ourselves vacated here off at Bravo 3. And as we discussed, we'll make our way inbound towards the domestic terminal. Again, some quite strange behaviours there on the engine. You can see the RPM needles all hunting around. I've got the same power setting on all 4 throttles. It's a shame, up until the descent there, the aircraft was actually all working very nicely. Anyway, we're all clear on the left. We seem to have lost our frame rate here a little as well, but that may well be Cairns as opposed to the aircraft. We'll have the crew run through the after landing checks.
After the landing checklist. Cold flaps.
Set.
Oil cooler flaps.
Set to 30%.
Fuel pumps.
1, 2, 3, 4, off.
Master RPM control.
Set.
Auxiliary control boosters. Off. Wing flaps. Rotor flaps up. After landing checklist completed.
Okay, so the after landing checklist is complete, just coming onto the bay. And onto the brakes, park brake can go on. Another nice puff of smoke there from the engines. Just come up slightly here on the throttles. Till we've got the aircraft shut down.
Flaps up.
Indicating flaps up. Again, I'm not sure whether or not that's the power setting here set by the flight engineer, but we've got significantly higher RPMs there on both the 1 and 2 as opposed to the 3 and 4. Anyway, finally we'll have our crew run through the parking checks.
On parking checklist. Brake selector level. Emerge. O dilution.
Set.
Engine 1 ignition off. Engine 4 ignition off. Engine 2 ignition off. Chokes on. ordnance lights on. Stairs checked. Doors open. Pins on. On-parking checklist completed.
Okay, so the doors are open, the passengers should be disembarking fairly shortly. Overall, I did enjoy the flight out there in the L1049, good fun, certainly something a little bit different. As I say, a little bit strange there down final approach, but we'll discuss that more during the debrief and the conclusions of this review. So there you go, ladies and gents, I hope you enjoyed another outing in the iconic Connie. As I mentioned during the introduction, I have received quite a number of requests to take a look at the product again, and overall I certainly feel that the amount of work Red Wing have put in, the product does deserve another look. I wanted to go with another full review as opposed to simply making a flight in the aircraft, really to try and demonstrate as best I can to you all of the features and functionality which have been added to the aircraft. Anyway, as we usually do with a review, we'll break everything down into negatives and positives. I have to say there are still a few negatives as well with the product. So we'll start with those and then we'll work our way through to what I like about the Red Wing Connie. So I think that the main negative that really sticks out for me during the flight there was the aircraft's handling characteristics during the landing. As mentioned at the time, it felt very strange, very right-wing heavy. Again, all of the engines were at the same power setting. We needed an awful lot of rudder trim to counteract it and get the ball centered up. I'm not really sure what would have been causing that, since I didn't experience any of the same behaviour during the takeoff. The aircraft, as I say, was actually quite nice to hand fly during the departure. Perhaps there's an issue there with using the automated flight engineer in terms of the fuel management or the engine management. But nevertheless, I did try a couple of landings and I had the same behaviour every time. The aircraft really doesn't feel very pleasant in the approach configuration. The controls feel rather vague and very heavy, which may well be true to life. But it felt to me as though there was an issue there, and again, it really only seemed to plague the aircraft during the approach and landing. Other negatives, we talked about the precision and the overall level of polish with the product. I'm not sure whether or not the product is now officially finished, since it has now released on the marketplace. I would suspect so. There's no egregious errors now with the product, but again it just has that overall feeling of not quite yet being finished. For example, the sounds, whilst much improved over the previous version that we looked at, there's still quite a bit of clipping in the sounds. I don't know whether or not that's quite the right technical term, but I know from editing video myself, if you try and clip two pieces of the same audio loop together, occasionally you'll hear a little pop between the two clips, and certainly I could hear that a lot with the engine note of the aircraft. The flanging, which I recall was pretty awful on the engines previously, seems to have been completely removed, more or less, so that's really great to see. Gauges and switches fall under the same category really. A little bit more finesse would have been nice, particularly with the gauges. As I mentioned, particularly with the attitude indicator there, noticeably off-centre, and the gauges can be quite hard to read at times given the font used. All in all now, with the exception of the landing characteristics that at least I experienced there during the flight, I wouldn't say that the Super Connie has any major issues that are really going to detract from your enjoyment of the product. But again, as I say, there are just lots of little niggling issues here and there which do, of course, start to add up. The same goes with the modelling and texturing, certainly vastly improved over what we saw previously, and now I do find the aircraft to be done very much to a standard acceptable within the sim. But there are still a few areas modelled quite rough around the edges, and some of the texturing does look a little bit last generation. Anyway, that's most of the negatives that jump out at me covered. There are a few things that I would say hold a middle ground, so we'll discuss those before we move on to the positives. The FPS was reasonable. I was getting about 52 frames per second in the Connie versus about 70 in the default Cessna 152. I can only assume there the low FPS at the end on the ground was as a result of being in Cairns as opposed to the aircraft, since I didn't really experience any other noticeable FPS issues whilst using the product. I think for me the flight model as well would go into a bit of a middle ground. It does feel plausible, but overall probably not that accurate. The aircraft felt pretty reasonable on the takeoff. It seemed a little bit overpowered perhaps initially as we climbed away. Certainly as compared with the DC-6, the L1049 is noticeably more powerful, and that may well be true to the real-world aircraft. I'll leave that to you to decide for yourselves. The same in the cruise, the power settings seem to be a little bit on the low side, but that may be accurate. To hand fly the aircraft did feel like it had some weight to it, but again the flight model felt somewhat simplistic, and we've already discussed the issues there during the descent. Sounds again overall are somewhat of a mixed bag. The engine sounds are much improved, the same goes with the cockpit sounds. Really nice as well to have the crew audio. The Connie certainly sounds like it has a lot of power behind it, which is great. But once more, even to my untrained ear, there's quite a few noticeable sound issues with the sound set. Anyway, moving on to the positives. Firstly, I have to absolutely commend Red Wing for the amount of effort that they put into the product post-release. We've obviously seen quite a few products coming into Microsoft Flight Simulator at this point in early access, and many of those get very little attention from the developer thereafter. So again, I'm very pleased to see that Red Wing have continued to develop the Connie as they said they would. It is pretty clear to me as well that a lot of love, care and attention has been put into the Super-Constellation. I don't think most of the issues I've come across and mentioned here today are through a lack of trying. I gather Red Wing is a pretty small development team, so to do all of the modelling, texturing, sounds, systems, etc., obviously to get all of those spot on is going to be quite an undertaking, and again, hopefully they'll continue to work on the product, continue to refine the Connie. Systems depth was pretty reasonable overall. I personally wouldn't call it study level, but it was nice to see that we had failure modelling. Most of the systems do seem to function, and obviously the engines there, for example, have been modelled in some detail. For me personally though, it doesn't feel as though there's quite as much modelling going on there behind the scenes as, for example, with something like the PMDG DC6. I do really like the level of functionality that's been given to the Connie, as well as some of the smaller details that we looked at, for example the flight engineer's logbook. With regards to the onboard clipboard, again there are options available there which I've yet to see with any other add-on. And so once again, I do think it would be fair to say that Red Wing are trying to make the L1049 the best product that they can. The failure modelling as well, I said we'd take a quick look at, so just a couple of quick demonstrations here of some of the options available. So first things first, we are back on the flight deck, once again descending into Cairns, flying the same approach procedure. Just coming into a layer of cloud, so currently a little bit tricky to maintain a visual lookout. And just as we break cloud there, you can see we've actually had a bird strike. Very nice visual modelling there, if a little bit gory and overdone. It would have been nice to hear a bit of a bang there. I think that's rather missing from the effect, but again, overall nice modelling, definitely not something I've seen in the sim before. By the amount of matter left there on our windshield, I'm not sure whether or not we actually hit a bird or a kangaroo. It's our unlucky day though, and as we make our way in towards Cairns here, we haven't just damaged the windshield but also the engines. Looks like we've got an engine fire there on the number 3, the number 4 certainly not looking too healthy either. And once again, really nice visual effects there on the product, some of the best that I've seen in the sim to date. It certainly helps to make the failure scenario seem all the more plausible. Anyway, 2 engines dead, flying blind as well. It might not be too easy to get the aircraft down in one piece. And sure enough, if you do have to go for that crash landing, again, really nice visual damage modelling on the aircraft, the best I've seen in the sim. I don't recall any other product really even coming close. Most of the control surfaces can be damaged, the same goes for the props. You can see they've bent up there as we carried out our wheels up landing. And again, nice smoke effects, nice fire there. That's all based on the engine fire scenario, which we ran just a moment ago. So as you can see, certainly in terms of visual effects, really nice failure modelling there, certainly significantly better than any other product that I've come across in the sim. And in terms of the system's behaviour with regard to the failures, that all seemed to be pretty reasonable as well. Is it worth the money? As always, that's for you to decide, but I would say given that the €50 price point is more or less competing with the likes of the PMDG DC6, and now as well of course we have some study level jets retailing at around $35, $40, I think it is a little bit tricky to justify the price point of the Connie in its current state. Once again though, Red Wing do get my highest praise for their continued development of the product. I hope they will continue to refine the Connie going forward. Certainly at this point, if it is an aircraft you're fond of, then I think you'll get some enjoyment out of the product. And whereas previously with the early access version of the aircraft I wasn't too interested in taking it out again, here I can genuinely see myself having a little bit more use for the Connie in the future. Anyway guys, another review of the aircraft all wrapped up. I do hope you enjoyed it and found it to be of use. Once again, if you did, please consider giving it a like. If you want to see more content from the channel, then please consider subscribing as well. As ever, a very heartfelt thank you to my channel members and patrons for your continued support. It's a huge help. And once more, I do hope all of you are having a great day wherever you are. Take really good care, and I will see you all again soon.